Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, when I talk about cooking and sometimes expose colors of the chameleon cook. Well, today's post is going to be something of a hybrid because the COVID-19 virus is percolating around Asia and the world and is giving people pause about stocking up on food and so forth. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to talk about eggs because that's where I started this video before the virus stuff took over. So let's get into it. As far as the virus is concerned, you've probably seen on multiple news outlets the need to have 14 days of food in your house or apartment in case you need to self-quarantine. Well, I would say that having a stock of 14 or 30 or 300 days worth of food is always something to consider. My mother, a veteran of the Second World War and of rationing in England in the post-war days, was a hoarder. She had a walk-in pantry in our home in Burnham in Buckinghamshire, and you could go in there and it was like Aladdin's cave. There were cans of just about everything. There were dried goods. There were every conceivable form of pasta and rice and whatnot. So I could just go in there at any time, pick out something and make a meal, and you wouldn't even notice what I had taken. There was so much. She had easily a year's supply of non-perishable food in the pantry. So in the event of a nuclear holocaust, she could squirrel herself away in the pantry and survive for a year. That's a little bit extreme, but it is important to always have an emergency shelf or emergency rations. And I'm going to take the 14 days of the COVID quarantine as a benchmark. So the basic question is, what does 14 days worth of food look like? Well, for me, it's actually not all that much because I usually eat only one meal a day and not a particularly substantial one either. But I am a little bit out of the ordinary. So we'll start with me and then we'll move from there. I always have plenty of rice in my kitchen. And I don't only have a lot of rice, I have a lot of different varieties. I've usually got at least a kilo of basmati, another of jasmine rice, and then one of short-grained arborio rice or some other form of starchy rice that can be used for things like rice puddings, risottos and so forth, and which I've covered in other videos. So I could easily subsist on 3 kilos of rice for 14 days. It would be really dreary to eat nothing but rice, but I would survive, and I would make it a little less dreary by, at minimum, adding condiments. I've got soy sauces, for example, different kinds of soy sauce. I've got chili peppers always, of course, in one form or another, usually pickled or some kind of sambal. I've got chutneys that I've made. They can form a meal that will satisfy you if it's not particularly interesting. Now, to add to that, of course, you need vegetables and or meat and or eggs. But the problem there is that they're not able to be kept for long periods of time. And when we say 14 days, I mean 14 days from the time you start. If the time you start is a month from now, then the food has to last for a month and 14 days. Now, in order to have the requisite variety to add to the rice, you could use canned vegetables or canned meats, but I generally prefer not to use them for a couple of reasons. One of them is that they're usually highly processed, and you're going to find things like preservatives, salt, sugar, and other things that you don't necessarily want in your diet. At least they're not things that I want in my diet. So what I tend to do is to freeze my meats and vegetables. With the vegetables, what you can do very, very simply, take some greens, chop them coarsely, blanch them in boiling water for a minute or so, shock cool them in cold water, and then freeze them. And you can easily store 14 days of vegetables that way. And of course my meats I just have in the freezer ordinarily. I also keep a fairly large stock of dried pasta, usually linguine and or spaghetti, shells, fusilli, bow ties, quite a different range, because I find the variety to be a little bit more interesting than always using one kind of pasta. I also keep dried beans on hand. I've always got black-eyed peas because I like them, sometimes red kidney beans, butter beans, what have you. Most root vegetables will keep fairly well, almost indefinitely, if you keep them in a reasonably cool place. Back in New York, I had a root cellar where I could store things like yams, potatoes, carrots, and whatnot, and they wouldn't start sprouting. Here in Cambodia, I have to be a little bit careful, but I can always keep about a kilo of potatoes either out in the cooler part of my apartment or in the crisper in my refrigerator. So with different forms of rice, of pasta, of beans, plus frozen vegetables and meats, I can survive quite happily in my apartment for 14 days without having to go out or make contact with other people. The issue would be for me with desserts. I'm not a great dessert eater, and I usually make apple crumble or some form of cooked fruit when I need something to finish off a meal. But I'm not going to be able to store apples indefinitely, and I'm not going to be able to supply myself with 14 days of desserts. But quite recently, I hit upon an idea that followed on from my video called Hot and Cold. You may remember in that I made a frozen soup. Well, after that, I had a little experiment with making granitas, that is, frozen ices. I used to be a really, really big fan of homemade ice cream. I used to have 4 ice cream makers, and I now have none. But I can still make frozen desserts in the freezer simply by freezing water to which I have added a flavoring. And there's all kinds of flavorings that you can add. One of them is rose water. Very, very simple. Just place some ice in a container, add a few drops of rose water, orange flower water if you like, and freeze. And when it's mostly frozen, take it out, chop it or scrape it with a fork so that you break up the large chunks, and there you've got yourself a nice, refreshing dessert. Well, I added to that a little bit the other day because I wanted to make a veloute sauce for one of my pies. Now, veloute is a gravy that is thickened with egg yolks. Here you can see my example. I've done this for years and years. It's another way of thickening and providing not just body but flavor to the gravy. So I had to separate the eggs, and here I always have a problem because you separate the eggs, use the yolks in the veloute. You make the veloute by whipping the yolks together, stirring them into the gravy, and then heating really, really slowly and carefully so that you make an emulsion. If you do it speedily, you end up with a gravy plus scrambled eggs. But if you do it very, very gently, the yolks thicken. Now you've got a pan of egg whites. And you can freeze egg whites, that's fine. But at some point, you need to use them. What are you going to use them for? Well, sometimes I make an egg white omelet. That's an easy option. And very, very rarely I make meringue. Meringue is also a little bit tricky to do at home because you have to whip the whites until they form stiff peaks, and then you have to bake in a very, very slow oven until the whites harden, and then you can use them in desserts. I did something a little bit different here. I whipped the whites, but instead of forming them into meringues, I simply put the bowl in the oven and baked. And it turned into a kind of, I guess, chameleon meringue. It was a softish meringue and very tasty. And then I froze it along with my granita. And so I formed this kind of version of what's called Eton mess, which is crushed up meringues and strawberries. But here we have chopped up meringue and granita. And it was very good. It's something I will experiment with more in the future. And probably make another video of at one point. But for now, it's the conclusion of my thoughts about what to do if you're stuck in your apartment for 14 days and you can't find a way to make a dessert. I mean, obviously I could bake cakes also. That's not a problem because I've always got plenty of flour. I've got oil, usually got butter as well, and some eggs, so I can always whip up some kind of pound cake. But this one is just a little bit more chameleon. So if you enjoy this idea, then tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I will continue on Friday with more thoughts about the use of statistics.